The little boy reached up with his tiny fingers, and the room went completely silent. The doctors froze. The nurses stopped breathing. The father, a man who had moved mountains with money, who had purchased the finest medical minds on the planet, who had not slept a full night in 2 years, stood with his hands trembling at his sides, tears already falling before he even understood what he was witnessing. Because what this 3-year-old child was doing in that sterile hospital room in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon was something no specialist had ever thought to try. Something no textbook had ever described. Something that billions of dollars, years of research, and the combined intelligence of 17 world-class ophthalmologists had completely, utterly, and humiliatingly missed. The 2-year-old boy sitting on the examination table, the blind boy, the boy his father had prayed over every single night since the diagnosis, suddenly blinked. And then he turned his head toward the light. His father dropped to his knees and let out a sound that no one in that room would ever forget for as long as they lived. Before we go any further, I need to know where you are watching this from right now. Drop your country in the comments below. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, Germany? Wherever you are in this world, I want you to find a comfortable place to sit because this story is going to take something from you and then give it right back, tenfold. This is a story about blindness, about fatherhood, about the kind of love that doesn't come with a price tag, and about a 3-year-old child who did what no human adult was wise enough to do. Stay with me. This one is going to change you. His name was Adrian Calloway, and by every measurable standard the world uses to define success, he had won. 34 years old. Self-made. The kind of man whose name appeared in financial headlines before he had even turned 26. He had built his fortune from nothing, from a childhood in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, where the heat didn't always work in winter, and his mother stretched every dollar across the week like a thin sheet trying to cover something too large. He had watched her work double shifts at the hospital where she cleaned floors and emptied bedpans, and he had made a promise to himself, not a dramatic, cinematic promise, but a quiet, bone-deep one, that her sacrifice would mean something. And it did. By the time Adrian was 30, he had sold his second tech company for an amount that made national news. By 32, he had diversified into real estate, clean energy, and biomedical research. He owned homes in 4 states. He had a staff of 41 people. He had been on the cover of 3 different business magazines. He had everything. And then, at 32, his wife Elena gave birth to their son, Noah. And Adrian discovered that everything he had accumulated before that moment was, in the most honest and humbling sense of the word, nothing. Noah Calloway came into the world on a Thursday morning in March, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn little jaw. Adrian held him in the delivery room and cried in a way he hadn't cried since his mother's funeral, that deep, cellular kind of crying that comes from somewhere below language, below thought, below the self you present to the world. He was not prepared for this love. Nobody told him love could feel like this, like your entire chest had been cracked open and everything soft and terrified inside you is now walking around outside your body in the form of a 7-pound human being. For 8 months, life was the closest thing to perfect that Adrian had ever known. He restructured his entire schedule around Noah. He left meetings early. He canceled trips. He learned how to give a bath, how to swaddle, how to read the difference between hunger cry and a tired cry. His assistant, a highly efficient woman named Priya who had never once seen him flustered, began to notice that he would sometimes just stop in the middle of a sentence and look at a photograph of Noah on his desk with an expression she could only describe as wonder. And then, at 8 months old, Noah stopped responding to faces. It was Elena who noticed first. She was playing peekaboo on the living room floor, the afternoon light coming in gold through the tall windows, and Noah's eyes, those beautiful dark eyes that had looked up at her with such perfect recognition since the day he was born, were no longer following her hands, were no longer tracking her face, were open and alive and blinking, but looking through her, past her, at something or nothing. She called Adrian home from a board meeting at 3 in the afternoon. He walked in the door and looked at his son, and in that instant, before any doctor had said a single word, before a single test had been run, he knew. The way parents know things. The way love makes you fluent in a language no one teaches you. Something was wrong with Noah's eyes. The first pediatrician said wait and see. Adrian waited 3 days and then flew in a specialist from Johns Hopkins. That specialist referred them to another in Boston. Boston sent them to a team in Switzerland. Switzerland recommended a clinic in Singapore. Every examination, every scan, every consultation added another layer to the same devastating conclusion. Noah Calloway, the son of one of America's wealthiest men, was losing his sight. The precise mechanism was unclear. The prognosis was uncertain. The options were limited. Adrian responded the way he responded to every obstacle in his professional life, with overwhelming force. He funded a private research team. He hired a full-time medical coordinator. He had Noah's case reviewed by specialists in 11 countries. He offered endowments to university ophthalmology departments in exchange for priority attention. He did not sleep more than 4 hours on any given night for 6 months. Elena watched her husband pour himself into the fight, and she loved him for it, and she also ached for him, because she could see something he couldn't. That for all his brilliance, for all his resources, for all the ferocity of his love, Adrian was approaching this the way he approached everything. As a problem to be solved by the right combination of intelligence and money. And some problems, she was beginning to understand, don't yield to either. Noah turned 1. He turned 18 months. He turned 2. And the world, for him, remained a place of shapes and shadows, present but unreachable, near but impossibly far. He could hear his father's voice and reach for it. He could feel his mother's arms and relax into them. But his eyes, those beautiful dark eyes, had gone somewhere else. Adrian sat beside his son's crib on the night of Noah's 2nd birthday, long after the house had gone quiet, and he asked the darkness a question he had never asked before. What am I missing? He didn't know yet that the answer was already on its way, that it was 3 years old, that it was staying in the room down the hall. Her name was Maisie, 3 years old. Curly red hair that her mother could never quite tame into anything resembling order. Freckles across her nose that her grandmother called angel kisses and her older brother cults. Small for her age, but with a presence that adults consistently noticed and struggled to articulate. Something about the way she paid attention, the quality of her stillness when she was watching something, as though she was absorbing more of the world than other children, filing it away in some interior place that the rest of them simply didn't have. Maisie's mother, Claire, was a pediatric occupational therapist. She had come to work for the Calloway family 8 months ago, not as a permanent staff member, but as a consultant brought in specifically to help design sensory and developmental programs for Noah. She was 31 years old, professionally excellent, emotionally intuitive, and completely unprepared for Adrian Calloway. Not because of his wealth. Claire had worked with wealthy families before and found that money, in her line of work, was more often a complication than a convenience. She was unprepared for Adrian because of what she saw when she watched him with Noah. The way he sat on the floor without any self-consciousness, his expensive suit jacket folded neatly over the back of a chair, building towers with oversized soft blocks and then letting Noah knock them over with an expression of such genuine, uncomplicated delight that it made her throat tighten. The way he narrated everything, not in the performative way some parents did, self-consciously aware of the developmental benefit of verbal input, but simply because he wanted Noah to hear his voice.
To know he was there.
To never, for a single moment, feel alone in his darkness. Claire brought Maisie with her to work 3 days a week. There was no formal childcare that worked perfectly with her schedule, and the Calloway household was large enough and staffed enough that a toddler in the mix caused no disruption. Adrian had said, without hesitation, that Maisie was welcome whenever necessary. He had barely looked up from the floor where he was sitting with Noah when he said it, and somehow that casualness made it feel more generous than any formal accommodation could have. Maisie, from the very first day, was fascinated by Noah. This was not unusual in itself. Children are often drawn to other children, and the gap in age between them, just a year, was small enough that they were natural companions in size and pace. But the nature of Maisie's fascination was different from the beginning. She didn't treat Noah the way some children treated children with differences, with confusion or discomfort or an exaggerated caution. She treated him the way she treated everything that interested her, with total, unblinking attention, as though she was working something out. She would sit across from him during their shared floor time and simply watch his face. Not unkindly, not with the frank, sometimes brutal curiosity that toddlers are known for, but carefully, thoughtfully, with an expression that her mother described to Adrian one afternoon as the same face Maisie made when she was trying to figure out how something worked. "She's studying him," Claire said, and there was something in her voice that was equal parts professional observation and maternal pride. Adrian glanced across the room to where his son sat batting softly at a hanging sensory toy, while Maisie sat 2 feet away, her chin propped in her small hand, watching. "She's not the only one," he said quietly. In those 8 months, something had shifted in the Calloway house. It had started as a professional arrangement, Claire and her expertise, Noah and his needs, but it had grown into something warmer and more complicated than either of the adults had planned for. They ate dinner together 3 nights a week because Maisie's sessions with Noah ran long, and it was easier than packing up and leaving. They talked, first about Noah, then about therapy, then about childhoods and families and the strange paths that lead people to the work they end up doing. Adrian told her about Cleveland and his mother and the promise he had made in the coal department. Claire told him about her own daughter born early, 3 weeks premature, placed in a warming bed, and how those first terrifying days had rerouted her entire sense of what mattered.
They were not a family,
but they were something. Something that didn't have a clean word. And in the middle of all of it, quiet and observant and working something out in her remarkable 3-year-old mind, was Maisie. She had noticed something about Noah's eyes. Something that she didn't have the language to explain to an adult. Something that sat in her body as a feeling, a wrongness, a something is stuck feeling, that she turned over, and over the way she turned over interesting rocks she found on the sidewalk, examining every angle, waiting for the thing to reveal itself. She was 3 years old. She did not know the words cornea, or membrane, or ocular surface. She did not know that the world's finest ophthalmologists had looked into those eyes with instruments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and found the source of Noah's blindness to be, at its core, still partially contested.
She did not know any of that.
What she knew, what her body knew, in the wordless, direct way that very young children sometimes know things, was that there was something covering Noah's eyes. Something that didn't belong there. Something she had decided on the morning that would change everything that she was going to take off.
It was a Tuesday.
equals. Not a morning marked by anything significant on anyone's calendar. No scheduled specialist visits, no research calls, no consultations. Just a Tuesday in October, the light coming in thin and gold through the east-facing windows, the smell of coffee, and something Elena had put in the slow cooker overnight, the quiet sounds of a house preparing itself for the day. Adrian had been up since 4. He almost always was now. He had taken to sitting in the kitchen in the dark hours before dawn, not working exactly, but not sleeping either, existing in a kind of suspended state that felt like the only honest response to the situation he was in. He had money, and he had willpower, and he had love in quantities that felt almost violent in their intensity, and none of it had given his son back his sight. In those dark morning hours, he sat with that fact and let it be what it was. Claire arrived at 7:30 with Maisie, who was wearing a yellow raincoat despite the absence of rain because she had insisted upon it, and Claire had learned, in 3 years of parenting this particular child, that there were battles worth having and battles that simply were not. The yellow raincoat was not one worth having. Noah was already up. He was in his usual morning spot on the large sensory mat in the sunroom, the room Adrian had converted specifically for him, with different textures on the floor, with wind chimes near the window that caught every small movement of air, with soft light and a consistent smell of lavender that the occupational therapists had recommended as an anchor. Noah liked this room the way he liked familiar voices. It was a place that made sense to him. Maisie walked in ahead of her mother, still in the yellow raincoat, dropped to her knees on the mat across from Noah, and did what she always did. She looked at his face. For a long moment, nothing happened. Claire set down her bag. Adrian came in from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, handed one to Claire without a word in the easy way they had developed, and leaned against the doorframe to watch his son. And then Maisie tilted her head. It was a small movement, the kind of movement a person makes when something comes into focus, when the angle finally shows them what they've been trying to see. She leaned slightly forward and stared at Noah's right eye with an intensity that made Claire lower her coffee cup and take a step closer without entirely deciding to. "Maisie,"
Claire said softly.
Not a warning, not a correction, just her daughter's name, offered like a question. Maisie didn't answer. She was somewhere else. She was in that internal place she went when she was working something out. She reached up with both hands, small hands, careful hands, the hands of a child who had learned to be gentle because her mother had shown her gently, and she brought her fingers toward Noah's face. Adrian straightened. His instinct was to step forward, to intervene, to protect, but something stopped him. Something he couldn't name then and would spend years trying to articulate afterward. A stillness that came over him, a sense that what was happening was more than it appeared, that the same instinct that had built his fortune and saved his companies and driven him through every adversity of his life was now, in this moment, telling him to stop, to wait,
To trust.
Maisie's fingers touched the outer corner of Noah's right eye. Noah didn't flinch. He turned his face slightly toward her touch, the way he turned toward familiar warmth, and stayed. Maisie pressed very, very gently at the edge of his eyelid. Not the eye itself, the edge, the rim. Her face was 3 inches from his face, and she was concentrating with every cell of her small body. And then, with the delicacy of someone removing something fragile and important, she pinched, barely, at something at the surface of his eye, and pulled. The sound in the room was the sound of 4 people not breathing. What came away on Maisie's fingertip was almost nothing. A thin, near-invisible film, the kind of thing that in different circumstances might have been mistaken for sleep, for crust, for nothing at all. It caught the morning light for just a moment as Maisie held it up and examined it with the satisfied expression of someone who has found exactly what they were looking for. Then she looked at Noah. Noah blinked. He blinked 3 times. Rapid, surprised blinks, the way you blink when light hits your eyes unexpectedly after a long darkness. And then he turned his head toward the window, toward the gold October light coming in through the east-facing glass. And Adrian Calloway, who had not cried in front of another human being since the night he sat alone beside his son's crib, made a sound that was not a word and sank to his knees on the sensory mat and pressed his hands over his mouth. Because Noah was looking at the light.
He was looking at the light.
In the hours that followed, the Calloway household became something between a command center and a church. Adrian called Dr. Miriam Osei first, the lead ophthalmologist on Noah's case, a woman whose credentials occupied 3 pages of a curriculum vitae and who had reviewed Noah's case more than 30 times without arriving at a complete answer. He called her from the sunroom floor, his voice not entirely steady, and told her what had happened. There was a silence on her end of the line that lasted long enough that he thought the call had dropped. "I'm on my way," she said. She arrived within the hour, which meant she had been driving before she finished the sentence. She brought 2 colleagues. She brought equipment. She set up in the sunroom with a speed and efficiency that under different circumstances might have been impressive to watch and was instead simply invisible because every eye in the room was on Noah, who was sitting in his father's lap and looking around. Not clearly, not perfectly, not the way a child with full sight looks at the world. But his eyes were tracking, moving. His head was swiveling towards sounds in a way that was new, not the auditory tracking of a blind child navigating space by hearing alone, but something that combined hearing and sight, the 2 senses beginning to knit themselves together into the unified experience of a world that could be both heard and seen. Dr. Osei examined Noah's eyes with quiet thoroughness, her face composed in the professional mask of a clinician, while in the background Maisie sat beside her mother eating crackers from a small bag with complete serenity, the yellow raincoat finally shed and draped over a chair. When Dr. Osei turned around, her professional mask was not entirely intact. What she described, what the examination revealed, was both staggeringly simple and medically extraordinary. A bilateral superficial membrane, thin, nearly transparent, presenting in a way that had been consistently misread in imaging as a natural variation in the tear film or a recurring mucoid surface deposit. It had been there from the earliest scans. It had been noted and consistently underinterpreted because no one had looked at it as the primary obstruction, because it was too thin, too faint, too easily dismissed. It had been, in essence, hiding in plain sight, and almost nothing that had stolen everything. What Maisie had removed from Noah's right eye, the tiny, near-invisible fragment she had held up to the light with such satisfaction, was the edge of this membrane. Her removal of that fragment had not resolved the blindness entirely, but it had broken the seal, had created a pathway, had done, with the natural pressure of a toddler's curious fingertip, what sophisticated instruments had never been positioned to do, because no one had framed the problem in a way that would have led them there. Dr. Osei said, and she chose her words with the precision of someone who understood their weight, that she had been looking at Noah's scans for 11 months and had not seen it, not truly seen it, because she had been looking for something that matched the diagnostic framework she had brought to the case. She had been looking, in other words, for what she expected to find. And Maisie had looked for what was there. Surgery was scheduled for the following morning. Both eyes. A procedure that, now that the membrane had been correctly identified, was not complex. Was, in fact, the kind of procedure performed routinely on much older patients with similar presentations. Adrian sat with Noah on the sunroom floor that evening after everyone had left, and he held his son in his lap and put his face against the top of his small head and stayed there for a very long time. "Hey, buddy," he said eventually softly. "Can you see me?" Noah reached up and touched his father's face with both hands. The way he always had. The way he found things in the dark. But this time his eyes moved to where his hands were. And Adrian held him tighter and let himself believe, for the first time in 2 years, that everything was going to be all right. The surgery lasted 47 minutes. Adrian spent those 47 minutes in a waiting room chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped in front of him in something that looked like prayer and was not exactly prayer, but was not exactly not prayer either. Claire sat beside him. Maisie was in the corner of the waiting room with a stack of picture books and her yellow raincoat folded beneath her as a cushion, because she had decided the chairs were not comfortable and the floor was better, and neither adult had argued the point. Elena, who had flown in on the first available flight from the conference she had been attending when Adrian called, was sitting on Adrian's other side with her hand wrapped around his forearm in the quiet, steady way she had always communicated her most important things. They didn't talk much. They had been through enough together that silence between them was never empty. When Dr. Osei came through the door 47 minutes later, she was wearing an expression that was attempting to be professionally neutral and was not succeeding. "He did beautifully," she said. And then she said the other thing, the thing she had looked at the data and looked at the surgical result and looked at 22 years of practice to say, and had said anyway because it was true and truth mattered. "I believe we're going to see significant visual recovery." Elena made a sound and put her face in her hands. Adrian stood up and then didn't know what to do with his body and sat back down. Claire looked at the ceiling. Maisie looked up from her picture book and observed the adults in the room with calm, assessing eyes, as though she had known this was how it was going to go, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Recovery was gradual, as it always is. Vision does not switch on like a light. It builds. It negotiates with the brain, which has spent 2 years reorganizing itself around the absence of visual input, and now must reorganize itself again around the presence of it. There were setbacks and adjustments. There were days when the light was too much. There were follow-up procedures, calibrations, a progression of increasingly gentle optical support. But Noah began to see. He saw his mother's face first, on the 3rd day after surgery, in the soft light of his room. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked, with the sustained focus of someone encountering something for the first time, and then he reached up and touched her face the same way he always had. But this time he was looking at his hands, at her cheekbone, at the tears on her face that he reached up, apparently, to investigate. He saw his father next. Adrian had come into the room quietly, not wanting to overwhelm him, and had sat down on the edge of the mat and waited. Noah had been playing with a soft toy, his eyes moving across it with that new quality of focused attention. And then he had looked up, had found his father's face, had stared at it for a long time with an expression that Adrian would describe for years afterward as the most serious thing he had ever seen. A 2-year-old conducting an examination, matching the face that had been voice and warmth and presence for his whole life to the visual reality that was now becoming available to him. And then Noah had smiled. And the world, Adrian's world, the world he had built and defended and poured everything into, rearranged itself around that smile into something better than it had ever been. He saw Maisie on the 5th day. She had come with her mother for what Claire had intended to be a professional follow-up visit, but what had become, over the past year, simply the rhythm of their shared life. Maisie walked in the front door as she always did, with the purposeful stride of someone who has been going somewhere for a long time and knows exactly the way. She walked into the sunroom. Noah was sitting on the mat. He looked up. He saw her. Maisie stopped walking. She looked at him looking at her. And then she sat down cross-legged directly in front of him, the way she always sat, close enough to see, far enough to give room. Noah looked at her face. Her wild red hair. Her freckles. All of it for the first time. He reached out and touched her hair. Maisie let him. She sat very still and let him and watched him explore this new world with his eyes as well as his hands with the expression she always had, that quality of paying full, unblinking attention to something she found genuinely worth understanding. Adrian and Claire stood in the doorway and did not speak because there was nothing to say that the room wasn't already saying. There are things that money can do. Adrian Calloway had always known this. He had built his life on it, on the leverage that resources provide, on the doors that capital opens, on the speed and access and option that come with financial power. He believed in money the way pragmatic people believe in tools. Not as an end, as a means. He knew now, with a clarity that went deeper than philosophy, what money could not do. It could not see what Maisie had seen. In the months after Noah's recovery, Adrian did something he had never done before. He stopped. Not retired. Not retreated. He restructured. He promoted the people who had been running his operations and reduced his own involvement to a level that was still significant but no longer total because he understood, finally, that the reason he had been building everything was sitting on a sensory mat in a sunroom in Connecticut getting better at telling the difference between a blue block and a green one. He also did something else. He funded a research initiative. Not the kind he had funded before, not the kind aimed at finding the next technical breakthrough in isolation, but one specifically focused on diagnostic humility, on the ways that medical expertise, in its very sophistication, can create blind spots, on what it might mean to approach a patient's case without a preformed framework, on the kinds of things that only eyes unclouded by expectation can see. He named it, at Dr. Osei's suggestion, the Maisie Protocol. Claire received the news about the naming on a Sunday morning. She was in the kitchen with Maisie, who was eating toast and explaining to her mother, with great earnestness and considerable factual liberty, the dietary habits of flamingos. Claire read the email. She looked at her daughter. She thought about the day in October when a 3-year-old in a yellow raincoat had sat across from a blind boy and worked something out that 17 specialists had missed. She thought about how Maisie had looked at Noah not as a patient, not as a case, not as a problem to be solved, but simply as someone who needed something that she might be able to give. How she had approached him with curiosity and care and the direct, unhurried attention of someone who has not yet learned to look past what is right in front of them. She thought about what it meant to really see someone. She cried a little into her toast, and Maisie noticed, and patted her hand with one small freckled hand without interrupting herself about flamingos. Adrian and Claire are not a story, with a simple category. Life resists those. What they are is two people who came into each other's orbit at the precise moment that each of them needed exactly what the other had, and who built something from that, slowly and honestly over shared dinners and hard conversations and the ordinary miraculous work of raising children together. Noah, at 2.5, has begun what his therapists describe as a remarkable visual developmental trajectory. He is catching up. He points at things now. He brings objects to show people, holds them up to faces with a kind of look at this remarkable world energy that makes everyone around him feel it. He has his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw and, increasingly, a laugh that arrives without warning and fills whatever room he's in. He and Maisie remain, in the vocabulary of children, best friends. She is 3 and he is 2, and she is still the one who watches more carefully, who notices first, who reaches for things that others have overlooked. He follows her lead with a trust that is instinctive and total and does not require explanation. There are things in this world that no amount of intelligence or resources or effort can find, because they require a kind of looking that only certain people, certain uncomplicated, unhurried, fully present people, are capable of. Sometimes those people are 3 years old. Sometimes they're wearing yellow raincoats. And sometimes, when the world has gone dark and the experts have exhausted their frameworks and the money has run out of things to buy, the thing that finally opens a child's eyes to the light is the smallest, simplest, most human thing of all. Someone who looked at him. Not at his diagnosis. Not at his scans. Not at the problem. At him. And decided that what was covering his eyes, whatever it was, did not belong there. And reached out her small hand. And took it away. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the things we're looking for are sometimes found by the ones who don't yet know they're not supposed to be able to find them. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. Your presence here matters.